never felt myself as if I am understanding what he was writing. Okay, let's make an attempt. Each and every year I try to make an attempt to express Derrida's views as much and as long as I feel myself understand them, okay? Two articles from, one from Margins of Philosophy, the other one from Writing and Difference. Entitled Force and Signification. But first, before that, actually, the article from 1960, the other article from 1968, so early Derrida we are going to talk about. And in the year 1967, there comes that famous book, Of Grammatology, by Jacques Derrida. Okay. To be able to understand of grammatology, actually, one has to take a look at again, the Husserlian phenomenology. It has been written a kind of criticism against the metaphysical tradition in the West, and as well as usually considered as one of the important starting points of what would later become labeled as the strategy of deconstruction. Okay. In that limited sense, as far as I understand the term, deconstruction refers to the deconstruction of the dichotomies or dual concepts developed within the Western tradition. There are many, you know. So far we have introduced several of them. Internal, external, for instance, that famous and very important dichotomy, or say another very important, dating back, all those dichotomies actually, almost dating back to the Plato's philosophy, Plato's thinking. Another one, for instance, is the distinction made between sensible and the intelligible, you know, the sensible world and the intelligible world. So, and the whole discussion revolving around within the tradition, starting by Plato himself, actually giving a priority, kind of priority, to the intelligible over the sensible. Okay, and Nietzsche criticized this. Several others criticized this. Aristotle himself criticized this. Actually, as far as I know, there are only few figures who tried to criticize, make a critique of this very important dichotomy, as you know. And this dichotomy is a very important one for our own purposes as well. We are not going to be philosophers. We are not interested in philosophical thinking as such, you know. We don't care about what some interesting man tends to think about the world, etc. But what matters is that, okay, we are here to take a closer look at what conditions our own look at the world, okay? So, of course, as sociologists, we can say that it's not only ideas that we read in the school, etc., but rather the historical conditions we live in turns out to be the most important factor determining how we look at the world. Yes, all right. But the point is that these conditions seem to be somehow structured. And in one of these interesting essays in the book, Writing and Difference, as far as I remember, Derrida would remind us that structuralism was a kind of destiny for Western thinking, okay? Yeah, and it was quite natural for Western thinking to arrive at the idea of structure. Actually, from the very beginning, it was heading towards structuralism. And from then on, Derrida would make an attempt to develop a critique of structuralism. And actually, it's not that easy, you know. Structuralism is a very strong point, simply because it's about scattering the things at least in its earliest form, scattering the things in space, arranging the things in space. Okay? You know, we imagine a whole, whatever it is, doesn't make much difference. Then the whole we imagine again is constituted of parts, you know. And the arrangement of parts is nothing else than their spatial distribution. Okay, you arrange those parts in space. For instance, let me give you an example, and I've used that example in this class. You know, that famous concept of social formation, for instance, which Althusser has taken from Marx thinking. You know, when you imagine what a social formation is, you don't imagine it as if a chaotic form of unity, heterogeneous unity, rather an organized whole, you know, so that you can draw differences between its different levels or instances, you know. The economic instance, the social instance, political instance, cultural instance, etc. Other divisions as well. Think about, for instance, that distinction between public and private life, public and private sphere, elevated to the point of theoretical concept. Okay, public. We use this a lot, you know. Public life, private life, political life, economic life, etc., etc. But when you take a closer look, you'll see that indeed, in the empirical flow of life, it turns out to be almost impossible to distinguish what's political from what's economical. For instance, a credit taken by a bank, by a company from a bank. Now, we usually tend to think about this event as an economic event. But who can say us, who can tell us that this economic event is at the same time, is not a social event, is not a political event? So, however, you know, as you can see, you separate one aspect of the event as economical, another aspect of the event as social, another aspect of the event as possible. What I am doing here right now is nothing else than distributing the aspects in space. You know, Derrida was arguing about this, and actually, contrary to the claim, you know, this intelligent distinction between intelligible and sensible, intelligible is always above and over the sensible, you know. The sensible is something we despise, something we see as a disturbance, as an impurification of the intelligible. There corresponds also the distinction between internal and external. Now, what I am doing, I am putting words, distributing them in a space, establishing specific relations among them, you see. Okay. And as well, soul, mind, consciousness, as well, necessity. As you can see, the chain goes on, okay? With regard to the external, the empirical, contingency, order, change, etc. The chain goes and goes. And we tend to think usually that the relationship between these two actually has been determined, or in the Western tradition at least, Middle Eastern tradition is included in this. Therefore, Derrida would speak of being himself a Jew, Judeo-Muslim Christian tradition. Okay, this is the Judeo-Muslim Christian tradition actually. We tend to give priority to this, and trying to suppress that, organize this, what is beneath the intelligible according to the requirements of that intelligible. Therefore, for instance, when I put here necessity, this necessity according to the rules of intelligibility, which is usually referred as the logical necessity. However, when we start to discuss, for instance, the laws of historical transformation or the laws of the social relations, etc., what are we talking about? We are talking about something necessary, you know, something necessary. And history has taught us that actually there is nothing necessary in that sense. But when we stick to this idea, the danger is that there are no laws left behind, okay? And no laws left behind means that there are no rules to arrange things in space, words in space, okay? Actually, it is that arrangement of the words in space that helps us to understand that seemingly chaotic, unintelligible, sensible world. Okay. Now, Derrida would start his criticism exactly in this point, okay? And actually would open, if you ask me, a war against the supremacy of the, what can I put it, supremacy of the belief, the empty belief on the superiority of the internal. Okay. Now, this also relates us, or Derrida's writing, with the question of language, you know, simply because the undesirable fact remains, whatever you do, as we see in Levinas's case as well. That what are you saying, what are you taking, is always within the language. Okay. This means that when we are talking about the superiority of our intelligibility, for instance, in the case of a Descartes, okay, rejecting everything sensible and withdrawing into his own internality of consciousness or mind, and there trying to discover the facts, that solid ground upon which everything would rest. And that solid ground, you know, is interwoven with the words. The intelligible operates with the words. And the words, however, unfortunately, are not abstract and absolute things, but rather the struggle was about this. Rather, are the elements of a language which itself is historically and socially conditioned. And if we try to express the absolute, the unchangeable, immutable reality by making use of the words, there's going to be a problem here, huh? Since then, for instance, that was the division between, after Frege, a mathematician, logician, and a philosopher, so to speak, okay? The division between Carnap and Husserl. Even though there were many similarities between their thinking, okay? Carnapian line leads us to the analytic philosophy, so-called analytical philosophy. Husserlian line brings the things back to the continental ground, sort of continental ground, by emphasizing the structure of consciousness, etc., you know, those modalities. And what was this? Objects for consciousness. Now, the objects for consciousness themselves were empirical, referring to what happens actually in a given experience, the way a certain object appears actually in a certain given experience, okay? At that moment, I am seeing this in this or that way. But Husserl was also talking about, as you may remember, the possibility of an essence on the one hand, determining the essence on the one hand, and describing the object in its connection with the pole of identity. This would enable Husserl to arrive at the true concept of a thing, the ideal object, okay? In contradistinction to the empirical object of an experience as it shows itself in that particular experience. Well, in contradistinction to this, the ideal object, which remains as that very same object in all these different occasions, okay? And our capacity to identify, for instance, a house in all these different particular empirical experiences actually rests on that ideal object. Okay. So, however, that ideal object, even though it has been implied here that expressing the purity of language from the empirical, okay? So in that regard, Husserl as well, despite the opposition between his phenomenology and the analytic philosophers, comes closer to that line, okay? So off-grammatology is about this discussion, actually, okay? And off-grammatology is about this discussion, trying to show us that actually, in any metaphysics, what comes first is not the internality, but externality, and not the speech, but writing. Okay? So what's at stake is the structure of a pre-given writing, allowing the things to be distributed on space in a rather meaningful fashion. Okay. That was the major crack of the discussion, actually. And here, strangely enough, Derrida would concentrate his attack on the general assumption that speech acts, the empirical speech acts, now my talking to you, for instance, expresses me, my ideas, my thoughts, okay, better than my writing, okay. And actually, remember, Levinas was referring to this speech act. So it was too much important, simply because speech acts brings the situation into a face-to-face relationship, okay? Two individual souls, in a way, okay, speaking with each other and conveying meanings, exchanging meanings with each other, okay. Now, this has been thought from the very early on, actually, as the expression of the soul, you know, the breath. In speech acts, what I'm using is the breath, and breath is nothing else than, when it's said in Arabic, and being a Jew, Derrida was familiar with that tradition, refers to the nefs, you know, nefes, nefs, okay? So, nefes is something, breath is something which has been accepted as closely related, interconnected with what I am inside, my nefs, okay? So, nefes and speech acts coming out of me by nefes, breath, are taken to be the true expressions of my soul, okay? At least one can say sincere, you know? Now, Derrida here, hence the name of the book, you know, Nefes, or an analysis based upon speech acts, gives priority to the idea of the phoneme. The basic units of sound, you know, phonemes. However, the title of the book refers to grammar, okay? Is the basic unit of the written sign, okay? Therefore, the title is of grammatology, okay? Now, Derrida is now, therefore, making an attempt to establish a theory of language and theory of ideas and theory of becoming, if you like, based upon the written sign rather than the said sign, sound, okay, uttered sound. Okay. For this, he makes use of a very good example of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's confessions, okay, and tries to show that true and, how can I put it, true and, simply because he'll later introduce the concept, true and arche writing. Arche here first, prior to anything else, okay. True and arche writing, Rousseau's confessions had been organized, arranged in space, and therefore acquiring their meaning, okay? And at the same time, he will introduce in that book another important concept. Later on, I assume the another form, but substitution. Later on, this will relate with the concept race. Not too much later on, it is about the same years. So in these early years, Derrida writes, okay? Now, brief, belki bunu söylemek dersin başında daha iyi olacaktı. A brief summary of Derrida's work actually would be mentioned. It would be in order, I guess. Derrida was born in 1930. He was a quite recent last of the thinkers we are dealing with, and died in 2004. Okay. The important article, first important article, actually in that structuralist controversy I mentioned earlier in connection with Lacan's article, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of Human Sciences comes in 1966. 1967, three important books, Speech and Phenomena, where Derrida deals with the problems of Husserlian phenomenology, and Writing and Difference, a collection of important essays, actually, and the book of Grammatology comes at the same year. So in 1972, he writes Margins of Philosophy and Dissemination, again, two important books. In 1974, it has been said that Derrida's approach slightly begins to differ, okay? His writing beginning to distance itself from more metaphysical issues towards more ethical, aesthetical, and political questions. Okay. Examples are following the books Glass Spurs, written in 1970s, and in 1989 there comes another important book where he deals with Heidegger's phenomenology of spirit, and then in 1990 there comes a very important article. Actually, I use that article in my other lectures as well, and I consider that article as the best piece written on law so far in the 20th century, okay? The Force of Law, the article, Force of Law. There are other articles trying to bring up certain answers to our contemporary questions. For instance, the question of politics. The question of politics increasingly began to be important for us simply because we do not see any longer any possibility of meaningful politics in our contemporary world, okay? How come we are going to deal with the question of politics? Began to be an important question starting with the late 1980s and continuing unsolved until our today, okay? Our contemporary day. So, there were other English translations or collations of the articles published under title Acts of Literature, Acts of Religion, etc., containing all the important work, one of which we are going to deal with again. As far as I remember, its title was Faith and Knowledge, another important contemporary question Derrida trying to approach. Okay, so from this early writing, we can come to a slight, I myself, at least on my own part, slight understanding of what deconstruction is about. Okay, deconstruction is about the deconstruction of these dichotomic concept couples. Okay, so which has been well established in the Western tradition And you know, their existence is not that simple, simply because it is they who condition how we tend to think, okay? For instance, in these dichotomies, I find sometimes, most of the time, if you approach close enough to this question, this line of connections, okay, you'll find out that they are not that easy to overcome, okay? Especially when you try to write down a piece, you'll find out that they are almost impossible, strong enough to overcome, okay? There's the problem. So, okay, then I turn my attention, with your permission, to his article written in 1963, Force and Signification. It is in that article again, Derrida will tell us that, okay? There is, in recent times, an increasing anxiety about language. That's why structuralism, linguistic structuralism, comes to the foreground, okay? Even though I have read other interpretations in other commentaries on Derrida, I would say that this early Derrida of the late 1960s was rather under the influence of structuralism, or can easily be considered as somebody having post-structuralist inclinations, by simply pushing forward the arguments which had already been developed in structuralism, okay? So this article is about the declaration of the predominance of structuralism in Western thinking, okay? For instance, let me make a few quotations from the article, okay? He says that the structuralist stance, as well as our own attitudes assumed before or within language, are not only moments in history. They are an astonishment, rather, by language as the origin of history, by historicity itself. And also, when confronted by the possibility of speech, and always already within it, the finally acknowledged repetition of a surprise, finally extended to the dimension of world culture. So structuralism, according to the Derrida of those years, beginning to be a world culture, actually, okay? A surprise incomparable to any other, a surprise responsible for the activation of what is called Western thought. The thought whose destiny is to extend its domains while the boundaries of the West are drawn back. Okay? By virtue of its innermost intention, and like all questions about language, structuralism escapes the classical history of ideas, which already supposes structuralism's possibility, for the latter naively belongs to the province of language and propounds itself within it. Actually, here, everything is said, okay? Whole thought evolves within language and therefore directs itself, or predestined to direct itself, to a comprehension of structuralism. And this turns out to be a global phenomenon in our contemporary world, while the actual boundaries of the West is already withdrawing. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, the West beginning to lose its colonies, previous colonies, or other areas of influence acquiring their independence. As we will see, this would be an important theme for Jacques Derrida, simply because he was a Jew, a French Jew, born in Algeria. Okay. So the question of colony had a practical import in his own life as well. And he was also give, in all those discussions, just like in grammatology, he would also give priority to writing as the very possibility of speaking, okay? Now, we will see how, okay? And this how shows itself in his conceptualization of difference, or I don't know how to translate it. Actually, they say that in translation there is no difference. Only in writing there is a difference, replacement of the letter E with an A, okay? This A being replaced by, which A? This A. Replaced by A. Okay, this E is replaced by A. Derrida would insist that this is not an audible difference, but is only a visible difference, okay? Only showing itself in writing, therefore emphasizing the difference between writing and speaking, okay? Now, I hope that it will be much better understood when I delve into the beautiful details of this text. Difference, okay? An article actually written in, let me see, in 1968, okay? So, Derrida starts this is a speech, starts by saying that, I will speak, therefore, of a letter, one single letter, okay? And this letter is that letter, okay? Actually, remember, this is an act which had already been done by Sociology himself, okay? He was investigating, devoting a PhD thesis on that single letter, the Sanskrit A, okay? So it has that connections, okay? Now, what is that famous concept, difference? Okay. To be able to see this, I need to read certain passages, but before that, as an introductory remark, I will tell you what Derrida says in the article. Okay. He says that there is no phonetic writing. You know, we Turks, for instance, are very proud of our alphabet, claiming that our alphabet is quite phonetic. Saying that, actually, the sounds that we use in our speech and the letters that we use in our alphabet corresponds with each other. So, you know, French, for instance, is not a phonetic alphabet, okay? Writing is quite different from how they pronounce the words. In Turkish, however, we assume that it's very close. But a closer look will show you that, I'm not going to give any examples here. Closer look will show you that, actually, this is not the case, and writing there functions primarily as to establish the fixity of the sounds, okay? So the claim actually is implying that the sounds do not have any independent existence apart from writing. It is writing that pins them down as certain definite sounds. You know, prior to any written culture, you may find many people pronouncing the same words in quite different ways, the same sounds in quite different ways. You know, the local dialects in our own country as well can easily show. Okay, but with the introduction of writing, what happens is nothing else than a certain standardization of the pronunciation at the same time, okay, as well as meaning. Okay, so actually, this argument, the root of this argument, is to show you, leads to show you that there is no definite sound in actual speech act. And if there is no definite sound, just like the claim made already in grammatology, okay, it means that there are no fixed definite meanings in language too, okay? Only through writing, through the spatial allocation of meanings, actually, okay? This is the meaning of the arche writing in Derrida, which will, I hope, become more clear when we proceed in the discussion. Okay, the term difference under the light of this. You know, Derrida would say difference the term, French term difference, I don't know about the English term, has two different roots, okay? One implying delay, okay? And the other one not identical, okay? I'm gonna read the part referring to this. Actually, the French term differ, descending from the Latin differer. It's not important for us, okay? Latin differere, to it, the action of putting off until later, a relay, okay, a delaying of things, of taking account of time and of the forces of an operation that implies an economical calculation, a detour, a delay, a relay, a reserve, a representation. Actually, this is what we mean by representation, okay? In earlier work of grammatology, Derrida had already introduced the idea that representation is nothing else than the substitute of the real thing, okay? Actually, you know, if the real thing is here, you don't need any representation. You just point it out, okay? So the language, our knowledge, is about this delaying of the presencing of the real thing, okay? It's not here. It's not here, and instead of it, I am now giving you the words, okay? That would remind you, that would incite you, it's being here, okay? That's the idea, actually. It's not that difficult to grasp, okay? I would summarize here in a word I have never used but could be inscribed in this chain. This is an interesting word that now that he introduced, okay? Temporization. So difference with an A in its first meaning is about temporization. I'm not saying temporalization, okay? But temporization is in the more active sense of the form, not passive sense of the term, okay? It's not a reflective, but a direct world, so something temporizing is at stake, okay? Differer in this sense is to temporize, to make recurse, consciously or unconsciously, in the temporal and temporizing mediation of a detour that suspends the accomplishment or fulfillment of desire or will, okay? That's why, for instance, in Rousseau's Confessions, masturbation functions as a delay or replacement of the actual sexual intercourse, okay? And equally affects this suspension in a mode that annuls or tempers its own effects. And we will see later how this temporization is also temporization and spacing. The becoming time of space and the becoming space of time. The originary constitution of time and space, as metaphysics or transcendental phenomenology would say, to use the language that there is criticized and displaced. The other sense of differer is the more common and identifiable one. To be not identical, okay? To be other, discernible, etc. When dealing with difference, a word that can be written with a final TS or a final DS, okay, as you will, whether it's a question of dissimilar otherness or of allergic and polemical otherness, an interval, a distance, a spacing must be produced between the elements other and the produced within a certain perseverance in repetition. So in this concept difference, actually we are talking about that difference we have already talked. You know, remember structuralism, Saussure was saying that in language there are only differences without positive terms, okay? Now in this article, Derrida push forward the logic laying hidden in this statement and will show us something else, okay? Now the word difference with an with an E, okay, can never refer either to differer as temporization or to difference as polemos. Now, two things emerging out of this difference with an A, okay? Delay, okay, which is related with representation, which itself is related with temporization, and temporization itself. This is an important discovery, actually, which Heidegger had already been implied, but now in its clearest form we come across in Derrida's thinking. I'll try to explain why this is a very important conceptualization. And through temporization, the becoming time of space and spacing of time, or becoming space of time. Okay, it's a quite complicated something, and very important actual novelty in thinking. Actually, there were a few prefigures like Hegel, like Nietzsche, which precede Derrida, perhaps Aristotle himself, but not in that clarity, I guess. Okay, this is what it's all about. Actually, you know, in our original, usual thinking, we start our analysis by distributing things in space. You know, that was what, for instance, Saussurian structuralism was claiming to, you know. Forget about diachrony. What's important for us was synchrony. Okay, synchrony meaning study of language at a given moment in time. Okay, so forgetting about the history of the words or science, whatever, but rather raising the question how they relate with each other. Therefore, it means that there's spatial distribution. But in another sense, structuralism brings from a backdoor, so to speak, the question of history or time into its analysis. You know, it is about the temporal relationship of this science in a given chain of science, okay? It was an interesting question and helping us to see the question of history in a rather different way. But this is about, actually, this emphasis on temporization is about what usually called is the thinking of being or becoming. Now, what's the major difference? Is there anybody who has any inkling about it? What's the major difference in taking what's going on, the state of affairs, within the conceptual framework of being or within the conceptual framework of becoming? Or if you like, what's the importance of the difference between emphasizing the spatial distribution of things and temporal distribution of things? For instance, in Heideggerian phenomenology, in Husserlian as well, you know, Heidegger starts his analysis of Dasein, continues with the analysis of care through equipmentality, etc. And from a Husserlian point of view, this analysis has been found too much historic. And we can even say that even though Heidegger raises or formulates the question in the form of being, this was all about being, you know, in the form of being, he was heading towards a thinking of becoming. However, Heidegger never accomplished this simply because the third section of the book, Being and Time, has never been written. Okay? Later on, Heidegger turns or makes attempts to return back to this question, but has not clarified the issue sufficiently enough. The question is this. Now, we started the analysis of being through a static, static, atemporal analysis of Dasein. Okay? Being and time. The very title implies that already. And time section here in this book is lacking. It was the third part of the book which was never written. Actually, when Heidegger was writing the book, okay, he came to realize the increasing importance of the question of temporality. Okay. Why the question of temporality is important, and what the basic difference, what is the basic difference between being and becoming? Now, being presupposes the existence of that, in Platonic terms, the ideal world. Okay, okay. We, in our human bodies, are the passengers in this world, and this world is itself passenger simply because it is the world of appearances. Now, from this perspective, it is not worth to even know these appearances. It is not even worth to appreciate our being here in the world. Now, the Heideggerian position starts by appreciating our being in the world. Okay? There's no problem with it. But he poses the problem in the environment of, according to Derrida, the metaphysical language of the Western thinking, therefore necessarily forced to locate the question or express the question in special terms. Okay. So, however, what Derrida does here is to bring our attention the very importance of temporality, which had already been emphasized in Nietzsche, but not much understood. The eternal return, And the philosophy of the eternal return would emphasizing the fact of living in this world, okay, this ephemeral world in this ephemeral body, transitory body, okay, and a denial of this by Nietzsche has been described by the very nihilism, okay. So you deny the fact of your living here in this world, in this transitory relationships, okay. Actually, the eternal return implies that there is nothing else than that transition. Okay. Everything comes and goes, and what remains simply that coming and going. You can trace the roots of this idea in Aristotelian thinking of coming into being and passing away. The very difficult question of genesis. This means that nothing is here to stay. Okay. And this is the debate, actually, war, struggle against those who claim that there are ideas or essential things. This is being, okay? You start with being, you start with a pre-given existence which will here to stay. So Derrida is talking about, in this concept of difference, is talking about temporization. And this temporization will become not only the temporization of the world, structuralist analysis was limited within language, not only language, the word, but the temporization of the word itself. So he was heading towards understanding of becoming. Okay, let's have a break for time.